Hello, my name is Nick Sansano. I'm the chair of the Clive Davis Institute at Tisch School of the Arts at New York University. One of the most important lessons I try to teach my students at the Institute is the benefits of failure. I try to put across this idea that without risk, without failure, without trial and error, artistic development, entrepreneurial development, all development ceases. They have to be open to this idea of attempting something, learning from that attempt, and moving forward. There is a cultural fear attached to failure, and there's a cultural bias towards the idea of perfection. Both are really detrimental, in my opinion, to developing to the fullest of your ability without adversity, without the need to pivot, to regroup, to rebuild an argument. We see no progress. We see no advancement. So I've put together this little PowerPoint and presentation that I show to my students fairly regularly, at least once a year, the new students who come in and we review it over time. But I go through the idea that there's many instances and ways we can look at failure to benefit our development. So the one attempt I make is the artist as startup. So I deal with a lot of musicians and artists who are trying to become whether it be recording artists, performing artists, songwriters, producers, so forth and so on. And I try to have them understand that if they think of themselves more in the way a startup business does, they will need less time to develop and they will need sort of less time to make mistakes because they're going to go in making mistakes sooner. Therefore, they'll be learning how to deal with those mistakes sooner. So how do musicians and artists need to be trained to embrace the error part of trial and error? Now, of course, we know that there is a difference between an individual creative entrepreneur, an individual artist, and a business entity. And try to break that barrier down a little bit, which is like, what is a startup actually? A startup is an organization formed to search for a repeatable business model, a scalable business model, as I say here, but it's essentially built so they could fail. Learning from each failure, going from failure to failure, and understanding exactly what it is that they need to do to get to this repeatable and scalable model. A startup is essentially a temporary organization, meaning on the way to something greater, which is what each individual that I believe is studying with me is trying to do. They're on the way to becoming something greater. So because they're young, my students, failure analysis is a key thing for them to embrace. And I bring up this thing called the 18-40-60 rule. And again, it's because they're young. So the rule says when you're 18, you worry what everyone is thinking about you. When you're 40, you don't care. And when you're 60, you realize nobody's been thinking about you at all. And this is a liberating thought that it is just you in your own head creating a lot of the sort of negatives around failure, a lot of the false sort of expectations of perfection. So I go through this and I try to have them understand exactly what it is they're looking for in their development and what to look for in their failure. We call this failure analysis. I go into the fact that many of these businesses, in fact, they're in a research and discovery setting. You discover, you fail faster, you discover faster, you succeed faster, fail often in order to succeed sooner, right? These are statements that we take right from business textbooks. And can we adopt them for ourselves? I believe we could as individual creative entrepreneurs. Now, here's really the starting point of all the negative. Failure and fault are virtually inseparable in most households and cultures because as a child, we have been taught to associate failure with some sort of blame. Somebody's responsible for the failure. And that's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about failure like that has an origin of blame to it. We need to move past that to a culture, as Amy Edmondson says, a culture of psychological safety, in which we know that we can be rewarded by the learning from failure. Now, I explain to my students that it is important to understand the differences on the spectrum of reasons for failure. Meaning, yes, if you're at the bottom of the list here, if you look to the lower left, deviance, inattention, lack of ability, yeah, I mean, okay, that's definitely a negative. That means you're not doing the work, you're not developing, you're not putting the time in. But as we get higher in the scale here, as we get to the top right, all those more purple blue color items, there are definitely more admirable in their reasons for failure, meaning there's uncertainty, there's complexity, you're testing hypotheses, you're exploring. These are all good, right? These are all very admirable ways to fail in order to get to that place of being better than where you are now. And we know as creators, as people, like creation, like all things, is a nonlinear discovery process. We don't have a straight line process through this. We take a step forward, we take two steps back, so forth and so on. And one really great example of this that resonates with my students is the fact that Aretha Franklin, one of the greatest vocalists in the history of American recorded music, she was on Columbia Records from a period of 1961 to 1966. And that was a time of incredible commercial failure for her. She did not do well. She did not sell records. She was not a very popular recording artist. Now, we know, of course, 1967 onward, when she then signed to Atlantic Records, and then after that, Arista Records. That's the Aretha Franklin that we know. But what we don't know is this 5 or 6 year period where she was at Columbia, a period of massive artistic growth, but commercial failure. Ultimately, she found where she needed to be. And I always make the point that if Aretha Franklin can fail for 5 or 6 years and to find out where she needs to be and who she is and what she does well, all of us can. I also go to differences of interpretations of failure by comparing someone like Tesla to Thomas Edison, where Tesla was driven by the need to discover, Edison was driven by the need to make money. They both have a different sort of look at what failure means to them. So he was very personal, Nikola Tesla, very personalized, very emotional, somewhat unstable, might say. Thomas Edison was a CEO. He was the CEO. He was trying to build things that made money. Different failure analysis, way different failure analysis. Then I take them through a period of failure in the fine arts. We go back to the Middle Ages just to sort of bring some perspective to this. We show early struggles with perspective. We have paintings here that don't have a realistic three-dimensional view. They don't have the adherence to the golden rule. They don't have a vanishing point. They don't have all the things that we know that are important in perspective painting. It is like this for centuries. And then eventually in the 1500s, Raphael gets it right with this, the School of Athens. And we see that all of a sudden we went from this very nonsensical perspective to something that is incredibly lifelike and focused. And, it only took several thousand years to get to this point, of failure. Look, he understood what he was looking for. He needed to essentially go to a repository of a scientific place. He discovered that this is how we were going to get perspective by mathematically and enabling it mathematically to happen. I got to see it in person a few times. So I then take it to a point where we talk about common threads of failure in music production and artistic development, bringing in some of my own ideas. And I talk about these items as being the biggest problems. So you've got unlimited resources, meaning, too much money. Is that possible? I believe it is. Expectations, preventing exploration, excessive outside influence. You start believing the hype, you start believing the stories. Communication breaks down, and management of money and leadership distribution is another one that I found to be a common thread of failure. Then I go through different recordings that I made. I worked with Sonic Youth on a couple of albums, and we discuss what worked on one, what didn't work on the other, what did work on the other, and what didn't work on one, comparing and contrasting these things. Very much one being a very DIY, and another being a very sort of corporate, larger money album. In that, Daydream Nation was an indie recording, and Goo was on a major label. So I then go to a very similar set of instances with a French recording artist called I.AM, going through again the same basic idea of where my failure in dealing with elements of these two records that were back to back. Again, one a smaller label, more modest set of goals, and the next one, a much larger set of goals. We go from the DIY to a much more heavier set of expectations. So, is it possible to have too much money and time? I say yes. Then we talk about don't believe what people are saying about you in terms of your accomplishments. Art and writers need to write. Don't believe the hype. Expectations versus exploration. It's about me then. I was protective of my positioning, maybe. Maybe I was more concerned about what the expectations of others were rather than being an exploratory visionary for some of these recordings. Failure analysis, I did my own then. I tell them, I tell my students to then go through and what were your points of failure? Mine included unrealistic expectations, my inability to ask the difficult questions, my insecurity of my place in the trajectory of things, the fact of feeling threatened within a larger crew of people and a larger budget with more money and more pressure. So, and then I go through, we just try to expand out and say, okay, the macro failure analysis. What is it that really, like, kind of, what's the overarching issues that you have with your instances of failure? What are the psychological issues? What are the cultural issues you have, right? So I go through those as well. And, with this, a lot of it has to do with fear, fear of failure, fear of success, perhaps as well. But it's mostly, fear. It's mostly about what will people think? And if we go back to my 18-40-60 rule, like it doesn't matter what people think. What matters is the outcome of our work over the course of time, over the course of years, perhaps over the course of decades. So I tell my students, please learn from my mistakes and the mistakes of your instructors and mentors, and understand that we've all had very severe periods of failure. I'm sure that I'm not done with mine. But the idea is that we move forward. The idea is that you have to experience these failures to understand what it is you need to do in moments of challenge and expect the unexpected. Expect to find truths that you will not see apparent in front of your face before you go into making your argument, before you go into this exploration. You have to go in understanding that there will be surprises, there will be missteps, there will be mistakes. What's going to separate your effort from maybe from someone else's is that you're going to power through them, you're going to catalog them, you're going to have an analysis of that failure, and that's going to get you through the next mistake and the next one and the next one. And it just keeps going from there. So then I get to the end and I hope that I've made a difference. And if I didn't, I will show them this video again. Thanks for your time. I appreciate your looking, watching, listening.